Hey there, friend. Welcome to this quiet corner of the ancient world, where we'll drift gently through the dusty streets and marble halls of biblical times. Whether it's the middle of the night where you are, or you're simply seeking a peaceful moment to unwind, I'm so glad you've joined me for tonight's journey. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something wonderfully connecting about knowing we're sharing these ancient stories across continents and time zones. If this kind of gentle biblical storytelling helps you find peace, consider subscribing so you never miss these quiet explorations through Scripture. Now, settle in, pull your blankets a little closer, let the weight of the day dissolve like morning mist. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. We're simply walking slowly and softly through the life of a king in biblical times. Not just any king, but one whose days were measured in prayers and proclamations, in the rustle of robes and the whisper of sandaled feet across stone floors. Picture this: the first blush of dawn creeping across the ancient hills of Judah, painting the limestone walls of Jerusalem in shades of gold and amber. The city is stirring, but quietly, respectfully, because somewhere in the heart of the royal palace, behind thick walls and heavy curtains, a king is about to wake, and with his awakening, an entire kingdom will come to life. This isn't the story of conquest or glory that you might expect. No. Tonight, we explore something far more intimate and, in its own way, far more remarkable. We're going to follow one ordinary day in the extraordinary life of a biblical king. We'll walk with him through morning prayers and evening reflections, through the weight of decisions that could change the course of nations and the quiet moments when he was simply a man seeking wisdom from above. The ancient world was a place where the sacred and the mundane danced together like partners who had known each other for centuries, where a king's first thought upon waking wasn't of armies or treasures, but of the God who had placed him on his throne, where the business of ruling was inseparable from the business of the soul. So breathe deeply now. Let your shoulders relax. Let the modern world fade away like shadows at dawn. We're about to step into a palace where time moved differently, where each decision was a prayer and every prayer was a decision, where being a king meant being first and foremost a servant of the Most High. The pre-dawn darkness hung over Jerusalem like a familiar blanket, soft and encompassing. In the royal bedchamber, King Solomon stirred on his bed of cedar and ivory, not because of any earthly sound, but because something deeper had called him to consciousness. The oil lamps had burned low during the night, casting dancing shadows on walls decorated with carved pomegranates and golden cherubim. This was the hour he treasured most. He treasured before the weight of the crown settled on his brow, before the endless parade of petitioners and advisors began, before the thousand small decisions that would shape his kingdom demanded his attention. This was the hour that belonged to him and to God alone. The king's feet touched the cool stone floor, smooth from years of careful polishing. His sleeping robe, woven from the finest linen, whispered softly as he moved to the eastern window. Through the latticed opening, he could see the first hint of light touching the Mount of Olives, painting the olive groves in silver and shadow. But Solomon didn't linger at the window. There were rituals to observe, ancient practices that connected him not just to his own reign, but to the long line of kings who had come before him. David, his father, had begun each day in much the same way, and David's father before him, though he had been no king, had still understood that the first moments of each day belonged to the Almighty. The washing basin sat on a stand of polished bronze, the water within it cool and clear. Solomon cupped the water in his hands, letting it run over his face, down his neck, a simple act that was both practical and symbolic. The night was washed away. The day was born clean. His personal servant, A young man named Benaiah, who had served in the palace since childhood, appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal. In his hands, he carried the day's first garments, a tunic of pure white linen, soft as a cloud and fine as morning mist. Over this would go the outer robe, deep blue like the twilight sky, embroidered with golden threads that caught and held the lamplight. But not yet. First came the most important part of any king's day in biblical times: the morning prayers. Solomon knelt on the small carpet that had been his father's, its wool dyed in rich purples and crimsons, its edges worn soft by countless mornings of devotion. The carpet faced east, toward the rising sun, toward the temple that was still only a dream in the king's heart, but already complete in the mind of God. The words came easily, as they always did, not because they were memorized, though he knew them by heart, but because they rose from a place deeper than memory. They were the words his father had taught him, words that David himself had received from the prophets and priests, words that stretched back through generations to Abraham, to Moses, to the very beginning of the covenant between God and his chosen people. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," Solomon whispered, his voice barely disturbing the pre-dawn stillness. The ancient prayer, the Shema, that bound every faithful Hebrew to his Creator and to his people. But for a king, these words carried additional weight. They weren't just a declaration of faith, they were a reminder of responsibility. To rule in biblical times was to understand that earthly power was merely a reflection of divine authority. Every decision, every judgment, every law was meant to echo the character of the God who had established the throne. A king was not a ruler in his own right. He was a steward, appointed by heaven to care for God's people, as a shepherd cares for his flock. The prayer continued, flowing from the Shema into the personal petitions that Solomon offered each morning. Wisdom, first and always wisdom, not the clever cunning that helped merchants in the marketplace or soldiers on the battlefield, but the deep, abiding wisdom that could discern between right and wrong, between justice and expedience, between what was popular and what was righteous. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong, he prayed, echoing the request he had made years before when God had appeared to him in a dream at Gibeon. That prayer had been answered beyond his wildest hopes, but each day brought new challenges that required fresh applications of divine wisdom. As the king prayed, the palace around him slowly came to life. Servants moved through the corridors like gentle ghosts, their sandaled feet making only the softest whisper against the stone floors. They had learned, over years of service, to begin their day's work without disturbing the king's morning devotions. The fires were rekindled in the kitchens, water was drawn from the deep wells, and bread was set to baking, all in hushed reverence for the sacred hour. The morning prayers were not rushed. In biblical times, time itself moved differently, shaped more by the rhythm of sun and season than by any human urgency. A king's morning conversation with God might last until the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, painting the palace walls in warm gold. This wasn't seen as delay or indulgence. It was understood to be the most important work of the day. For how could a man make decisions that would affect thousands of lives without first seeking the guidance of the one who knew every heart, every need, every consequence that would flow from royal decree? How could a king judge between competing claims of justice without first submitting his own judgment to the perfect wisdom of heaven? The prayer time moved from petition to meditation, from speaking to listening. Solomon learned, as all wise kings learned, that God's voice came not in dramatic revelations, though those sometimes occurred, but in the quiet confidence that settled over a prepared heart. The decisions that had seemed impossible the night before began to clarify. The disputes that had appeared hopelessly tangled began to show threads that could be followed to resolution. When the prayers were finally complete, Solomon rose from his knees with the careful dignity that had been trained into him since childhood. Every movement of a king was watched, noted, interpreted. Even in the privacy of his chamber, he moved with the awareness that royalty was not something he wore like a crown, but something he embodied in every gesture. Benaiah stepped forward with the day's garments, and the transformation from man to monarch began. The white tunic slipped over Solomon's head like a second skin, its linen so fine it seemed to glow in the morning light. The blue outer robe followed, its weight settling on his shoulders like a familiar responsibility. The golden threads that decorated its hem caught the lamplight and threw tiny stars across the chamber walls, but it was the final element that truly marked the transition. From a cedar chest lined with purple silk, Benaiah lifted the crown of Israel, not the heavy ceremonial crown that would be worn for festivals and foreign visitors, but the simpler circlet of gold that marked the daily authority of kingship. As it settled on Solomon's brow, the transformation was complete. The man who had knelt in prayer became the king who would rule in wisdom. The morning light streaming through the eastern window had grown stronger, painting the chamber in warm gold and driving away the last shadows of night. Jerusalem was fully awake now, and the business of the kingdom could begin. But first, there was one more ritual to observe, one more connection to make between the earthly throne and the heavenly authority it represented. Solomon moved to a small table near the window, where a silver bowl held oil pressed from the first olives of the season. This oil, blessed by the priests and kept pure for royal use, would anoint his hands and forehead as a daily reminder of his consecration. The priests had anointed him king, yes, but that had been a ceremony. This daily anointing was a personal covenant, renewed each morning, a tangible sign of the invisible bond between the king and his God. The oil was cool against his skin, and its fragrance rose like incense in the morning air. Olive oil, the gift of the promised land, the symbol of peace and prosperity, the substance that lit the lamps and seasoned the bread and healed the wounds of his people. To be anointed with such oil was to be marked as one set apart, chosen not for personal glory, but for service to others. As the anointing was completed, the sounds of the waking palace grew clearer. Voices in the corridors, though still respectfully muted. The distant sound of gates opening, of the first visitors arriving to seek audience with the king. The gentle bleating of sheep being led to the temple for the morning sacrifice, their voices mixing with the songs of birds in the palace gardens. But Solomon didn't hurry toward these waiting responsibilities. Biblical kingship, true kingship as God intended it, was not about efficient administration or rapid decision-making. It was about moving with the rhythm of divine purpose, taking time to ensure that each action flowed from wisdom rather than impulse, from prayer rather than pressure. The king moved to another window, one that looked out over the city of Jerusalem. From this vantage point, he could see the morning activities of his people beginning to unfold. Merchants setting up their stalls in the marketplace, their voices calling out the virtues of their goods, women drawing water from the public wells, their ceramic jars balanced gracefully on their heads, children chasing each other through the narrow streets, their laughter bright as silver bells in the morning air. These were his people, the ones entrusted to his care by divine appointment. Each face in the crowd below represented a life, a family, a story that intersected with his own reign in ways both seen and unseen. The decisions he would make today would ripple outward through their lives like stones cast into still water, creating consequences that might not be fully understood for generations. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed a lesser man, but Solomon had learned to carry it as his father David had taught him, not as a burden, but as a privilege. To be chosen by God to serve his people was not a hardship to be endured, but a calling to be embraced with joy and reverence. The morning ritual was nearly complete, but there remained one final element that would bridge the private devotion of the early hours with the public service of the day ahead. From a shelf carved into the stone wall, Solomon took a scroll, its parchment yellowed with age and soft with handling. This was his copy of the law, the Torah that Moses had received on Mount Sinai, copied carefully by scribes and checked meticulously for accuracy. Every king in Israel was commanded to keep such a scroll, to read from it daily, to let its words shape every decision and inform every judgment. It was not enough to rely on advisors or tradition, or even personal wisdom. The king must ground his reign in the eternal principles that God had revealed to his people. Solomon unrolled the scroll carefully, his fingers finding the place where he had left off the previous morning. The words were familiar, but familiarity bred not contempt, but deeper understanding. Each reading revealed new layers of meaning, new applications for the challenges of ruling God's people in a complex and often hostile world. The scripture spoke of justice and mercy, of the responsibility of leaders to protect the vulnerable and defend the oppressed. It outlined principles for fair judgment, honest commerce, and peaceful relations with neighboring nations. But more than that, it painted a picture of what human society could become when it aligned itself with divine will. A place where righteousness flowed like a river and peace settled like morning dew. As Solomon read, the sun climbed higher over Jerusalem, and the palace around him hummed with increasing activity. Soon, very soon, the king would need to leave this quiet chamber and take his place on the throne, ready to hear petitions and render judgments, to receive ambassadors and consult with advisors. The day of public service was about to begin. But for now, for just a few more precious moments, he remained simply a man seeking wisdom from the eternal words of God, preparing his heart and mind for another day of serving the people who had been entrusted to his care. This was how every day began for a godly king in biblical times, not with the weight of the crown, but with the lightness of prayer. Not with the burden of decision, but with the joy of seeking divine guidance. And as the scroll rolled closed and the morning preparations drew to their end, King Solomon smiled slightly, feeling once again the deep peace that came from beginning each day in the presence of the Almighty. Whatever challenges this day might bring, whatever difficult decisions might need to be made, he would face them not in his own strength, but in the wisdom and power of the God who had called him to serve. The transformation was complete. The day was ready to begin. And somewhere in the distance, the first petitioners were already gathering at the palace gates, ready to bring their needs and disputes before the throne of Israel's wisest king. The soft shuffle of sandaled feet in the corridor beyond his chamber told Solomon that the time for private devotion was drawing to a close. But the transition from prayer to governance was never abrupt in the life of a biblical king. Like the gradual brightening of dawn, it unfolded with deliberate grace, each moment flowing naturally into the next. A gentle knock at the chamber door announced the arrival of Nathan, the king's personal scribe and keeper of the morning schedule. Nathan had served in the palace since the days of King David, his weathered hands having recorded countless royal decrees, and his patient eyes having witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. He entered now with the quiet dignity that marked all the senior palace servants, carrying in his arms the tools of his trade, fresh parchments, reed pens, and a small pot of ink made from lampblack and gum. "Good morning, my lord," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he understood that the sacred atmosphere of the morning prayers still lingered in the chamber like incense. "The day's petitioners have begun to gather, and the court officials await your pleasure." Solomon nodded, but made no move toward haste. In the bustling world beyond the palace walls, merchants might hurry to catch the best light for their wares, and farmers might rush to beat the heat of the day. But here, in the heart of Israel's kingdom, time moved to a different rhythm. The king's schedule was not driven by urgency, but by wisdom, not by efficiency, but by the careful consideration that each decision deserved. "Tell me of the morning's business," Solomon said, settling into a chair carved from Lebanese cedar, its arms worn smooth by the touch of royal hands. This daily briefing was itself a ritual, a bridge between the private contemplation of the early hours and the public responsibilities that would soon claim his attention. Nathan unrolled a small scroll, his eyes scanning the careful notations he had made. "First, my lord, there are 3 cases that require your judgment. A dispute between neighbours over a boundary stone that has been moved in the night, a widow who claims she has been cheated by a grain merchant, and—" Nathan paused, his expression growing more serious. 2 women who both claim the same infant as their own. The king's eyes sharpened at this last case. Such disputes were among the most difficult to judge, requiring not just legal knowledge, but deep insight into human nature. The wisdom of Solomon had already become legendary throughout the known world, and cases like this were the reason why. When human testimony conflicted and evidence was scarce, only divine discernment could pierce through to the truth. After the morning judgments, Nathan continued, the Egyptian ambassador requests an audience. He brings greetings from Pharaoh and speaks of trade agreements for cedar wood and precious stones. The captain of the guard also wishes to report on the security of the northern borders, where there have been rumors of raiders from Damascus. Solomon listened carefully to each item, his mind already beginning to sift through the complexities and implications. The boundary dispute would likely be resolved through careful questioning and perhaps a visit to the site itself. The widow's case would require examining the weights and measures used by the merchant, ensuring that justice protected the vulnerable as the law commanded. But the case of the 2 mothers, that would demand something more. "And this afternoon?" the king inquired, though he already knew much of what Nathan would tell him. The life of a biblical king followed patterns as regular as the phases of the moon, yet each day brought its own unique challenges and opportunities. "The master builder wishes to discuss the plans for the temple," Nathan replied, his voice carrying a note of excitement that he tried to suppress. The temple that would house the Ark of the Covenant and serve as the dwelling place of God's presence on earth was the great dream of Solomon's reign, the project that would define his legacy for generations to come. "He has completed the drawings for the inner sanctuary and seeks your approval before the craftsmen begin their work." The temple. Even the word sent a thrill through Solomon's heart. His father David had dreamed of building a house for the Lord, but God had reserved that honor for Solomon, calling him a man of peace who would build in times of prosperity rather than war. Every detail of the temple's construction had been planned with meticulous care, from the massive foundation stones that would anchor it to the earth to the golden cherubim that would spread their wings over the mercy seat. After the temple consultation, Nathan continued, "You are expected to visit the royal workshops where the craftsmen are preparing the bronze work for the temple pillars. And as the day draws toward evening, the Queen Mother has requested a private audience to discuss arrangements for the Feast of the New Moon." The mention of his mother brought a smile to Solomon's face. Bathsheba had been David's beloved wife and was now the Queen Mother of Israel, a position of honor and influence. Her wisdom in matters of court protocol and her understanding of the delicate relationships between the various tribes of Israel made her counsel invaluable. The Feast of the New Moon was not just a religious observance, but a political gathering where the loyalty of tribal leaders was renewed and the unity of the kingdom was celebrated. As Nathan finished his recitation, the sounds from beyond the chamber had grown more distinct. Voices in the corridors spoke in the respectful tones appropriate to a royal palace, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation. The business of the kingdom was waiting, and the people of Israel were ready to bring their needs before their king. But Solomon knew that the most important part of his day was already complete. The morning prayers, the reading of the law, the quiet conversation with God that prepared his heart for the challenges ahead. These were the foundation upon which everything else would be built. A king who neglected his relationship with the Almighty might make clever decisions or popular choices, but only a king who sought divine wisdom could truly serve his people as God intended. The final preparations began with the ceremony of the royal garments. While Solomon had already donned his basic robes, the full regalia of kingship required additional elements. Benaiah brought forth a sash of purple silk, woven with golden threads, that formed patterns of pomegranates and palm branches. This sash, worn across the chest and tied at the waist, marked the king's authority and reminded all who saw it of the fruitfulness and peace that characterized his reign. Next came the royal signet ring, a heavy band of gold bearing the seal of David's house. This ring was more than jewelry. It was the instrument by which the king's will became law. Documents sealed with this ring carried the full authority of the throne, and no decree was considered valid without its mark. Solomon slipped the ring onto his finger with the reverence due to such a powerful symbol, feeling its familiar weight as both privilege and responsibility. The king's personal weapons were brought next: a sword with a blade of finest bronze and a handle inlaid with precious stones, and a ceremonial dagger that had belonged to his father. These weapons were rarely drawn in anger, for Solomon's reign was marked by peace rather than war, but they served as reminders that the king's authority ultimately rested on his ability to defend his people and uphold justice by force if necessary. As these final preparations were completed, the transformation that had begun with prayer was finished. The man who had knelt in humble petition before God now stood ready to sit in judgment over his fellow men. But the connection between these two roles was never forgotten. Every decision would be filtered through the wisdom received in prayer. Every judgment would reflect the character of the God who had appointed him to rule. The chamber door opened, and the captain of the royal guard entered with measured steps. His bronze armor gleamed in the morning light, and his presence brought an air of martial dignity to the peaceful room. Behind him came two younger guards, their spears held at attention, their eyes alert for any sign of danger to their king. "My lord," the captain said, bowing deeply, "the court is prepared to receive you. The throne has been placed in the judgment hall, and the petitioners have been arranged in order of precedence. The scribes are ready to record your words, and the herald awaits your command to begin the day's proceedings." Solomon nodded, taking a deep breath as he prepared to leave the sanctuary of his private chamber. Once he stepped through that door, he would belong not to himself, but to his people. Every word would be weighed, every gesture observed. The crown that sat upon his head would become not just a symbol, but a burden, beautiful and heavy in equal measure. But as he prepared to take that step, Solomon felt again the peace that had settled over him during his morning prayers. The God who had called him to this throne would provide the wisdom needed for each decision. The law that he had studied would guide his judgments. The love for his people that burned in his heart would ensure that every choice was made with their welfare in mind. The king moved toward the door, his robes rustling softly with each step. Behind him, the morning light continued to stream through the eastern window, painting the empty chamber in gold and shadow. The private time was over. The public service was about to begin. And somewhere in the judgment hall ahead, the first petitioner was already preparing to kneel before the throne and present their case to the wisest king in all the earth. The corridor beyond the chamber stretched ahead like a pathway between two worlds. The private realm of prayer and contemplation that he was leaving behind, and the public arena of judgment and governance that awaited him. With each step, Solomon felt the weight of kingship settling more fully upon his shoulders, but it was a weight he bore gladly, knowing that he carried it not alone, but in partnership with the God of Israel. The day of the king had truly begun, and with it, another chapter in the long story of God's chosen people would unfold, shaped by wisdom, guided by prayer, and marked by the gentle authority of a ruler who understood that true kingship was not about power over others, but about service to the Almighty, and care for those entrusted to his protection. The throne room of Solomon stretched before him like a vast temple, its cedar pillars rising toward a ceiling painted with stars and cherubim. The morning light, filtered through high windows of precious stone, cast jeweled patterns across the polished floor. This was not merely a room, it was a sanctuary of justice, a place where the wisdom of heaven met the needs of earth. As Solomon entered, the assembled court rose as one, their robes rustling like wind through wheat fields. Nobles and officials, scribes and guards, all bound together by their service to the crown and their reverence for the God who had established it. The king's footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor, each sound measured and deliberate, carrying him toward the throne that awaited at the far end of the hall. The throne itself was a masterwork of craftsmanship and symbolism. Carved from ivory and overlaid with pure gold, it stood upon 6 steps, each representing one of the days of creation, with the throne itself symbolizing the eternal rest of the 7th day. Lions flanked each step, 12 in all, their golden eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings with divine authority. The seat was cushioned with purple silk, and above it, a canopy of blue fabric sewn with golden stars created a small heaven over the place where earthly justice would be dispensed. But as magnificent as the throne appeared, Solomon knew it was not the chair that commanded respect, but the wisdom that would flow from the one who sat upon it. The throne was merely a tool, like a scribe's pen or a farmer's plough, valuable only when wielded with skill and purpose. The true authority came from above, from the God who had promised to guide those who sought his counsel with humble hearts. The captain of the guard stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. Let all who seek justice approach the throne of Israel. Let truth be spoken and wisdom prevail. The king will hear your petitions and render judgment according to the law of the Most High. A hush fell over the assembly as Solomon took his place upon the throne. The weight of the crown seemed to increase as he settled into the royal seat, and the golden scepter felt heavy in his hand. But these were good weights, reminders of the sacred trust that had been placed upon him. Around the throne, scribes took their positions with fresh parchments and sharpened pens, ready to record every word of the proceedings. The law itself, inscribed on scrolls of finest parchment, rested on a golden stand beside the throne, available for consultation should any legal question arise. The first case was announced, the boundary dispute between neighbours. 2 men approached the throne, their faces weathered by sun and toil, their simple robes marking them as farmers from one of the villages surrounding Jerusalem. Between them walked the local elder who had brought their case to the king's attention, his grey beard and careful steps speaking of many years spent mediating such disputes. "Speak," Solomon said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber without strain or effort. "Tell me of this matter that troubles you." The first farmer, a man named Joab, whose hands bore the calluses of a lifetime working the soil, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "My lord king, I am Joab, son of Eliphaz, and I work the land that my father and his father before him tilled in the valley of Rephaim. For 20 years I have known the boundaries of my field, marked by stones placed by our fathers. But this man," he gestured toward his neighbour, "has moved the ancient boundary stone in the night, claiming land that has never been his." The second farmer, younger but equally weathered, shook his head vigorously. "My lord, I am Amos, son of Jedediah, and I swear by the God of Israel that I have moved no stone. The boundary has always been where it stands now. It is this man who seeks to steal land from my children, land that my grandfather purchased with silver weighed in the presence of witnesses." Solomon listened carefully, his eyes moving between the 2 men as they spoke. The law was clear about boundary stones. Do not move your neighbour's boundary stone set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. But determining which man spoke truth and which spoke falsehood would require more than simply citing scripture. "Tell me," the king said, his voice gentle but penetrating. What lies beyond this disputed boundary? Describe to me the land that each of you claims. Joab spoke first, his words coming easily as he described a field that he clearly knew intimately. Beyond the stone, my lord, there grows an ancient olive tree, its trunk scarred by lightning, but still bearing fruit. Beside it runs a small stream that flows only in the rainy season, and there the soil is rich and dark. My father taught me to read the land as a scribe reads words, and every rock and rise speaks to me of home. Amos nodded as he listened, then added his own description. The olive tree he speaks of truly stands there, my lord, but it has always marked the corner of my family's land. My grandfather planted barley in that field, and my father after him, and the soil still shows the furrows they made. The stream waters my sheep, and my children play beside it as I played when I was young. Both men clearly knew the land well, but their familiarity did not resolve the question of rightful ownership. Solomon closed his eyes for a moment, seeking the wisdom that had been promised to him. When he opened them again, he looked not at the two farmers, but at the elder who had brought them. "You have known both these families," Solomon said. "Tell me, what do you remember of the boundary in years past?" The elder stroked his beard thoughtfully. "My lord king, I have watched both these men grow from boys to fathers, and their fathers before them. The truth is that the boundary stone has been moved more than once over the years, sometimes by spring floods, sometimes by the roots of growing trees. Each time, the neighbours have replaced it where they believed it belonged, but memories grow dim and eyes grow weak with age." Solomon nodded slowly. Here was wisdom, the recognition that time itself could obscure truth, that even honest men might disagree about facts that had once seemed certain. The solution would need to account not just for legal rights, but for the practical reality of human limitation. "Bring me a measure," the king commanded, and immediately a scribe produced a reed marked with standard lengths. "And bring me also the records of land division from the time of Joshua, when the inheritance was first apportioned to the tribes." The ancient scrolls were brought from the royal archives, their parchment yellow with age, but their words still clear. Solomon studied them carefully, tracing with his finger the descriptions of tribal boundaries and family inheritances. The measurements were there, recorded in the precise language of surveyors and scribes, preserved for just such moments as this. "According to the records," Solomon announced, "the boundary should lie exactly 47 cubits from the great rock that stands at the valley's mouth. Let the distance be measured now, and let the stone be placed where the law and the ancient records decree." Guards were dispatched with measuring reeds, and within the hour they returned with their findings. The boundary stone had indeed been moved, but only by a few cubits, and in a direction that neither man had claimed. The true boundary lay between their rival positions, giving each man somewhat less than he had claimed, but ensuring that both received their rightful inheritance. "Let the stone be set in its proper place," Solomon decreed, "and let both men know that the God of Israel sees all boundaries, both those marked by stones and those written in the heart. Go in peace, and remember that good neighbours are worth more than broad fields." The two farmers bowed deeply, their dispute resolved not through victory of one over the other, but through the application of divine wisdom to human conflict. They left the throne room walking side by side, their enmity dissolved in the recognition that both had been treated justly. But even as the first case concluded, Solomon's mind was already turning toward the next petitioner. The widow, who claimed to have been cheated, stood waiting, her black robes and downcast eyes speaking of both grief and determination. Beside her stood a prosperous-looking merchant, his fine clothes and confident bearing suggesting a man accustomed to getting his way in business dealings. This case would require a different kind of wisdom, for it touched not just on matters of measurement and boundaries, but on the deeper questions of how the strong should treat the weak, how justice should protect those who had no protector save the law itself. The morning was still young, but already Solomon could feel the familiar rhythm of judgment settling over him like a well-worn cloak. Each case would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to demonstrate that the throne of Israel served not the whims of power, but the unchanging principles of divine justice. The day stretched ahead, filled with decisions that would ripple outward through his kingdom like stones cast into still water. In the distance, the sounds of Jerusalem continued their ancient rhythm, merchants calling their wares, children playing in dusty streets, the gentle bleating of sheep being led to sacrifice. The life of the kingdom flowed on around the throne room, sustained and shaped by the wisdom that flowed from this place, where heaven touched earth, where the will of God was made manifest through the careful judgments of his appointed king. And Solomon, feeling the weight of the crown and the lightness of divine guidance in equal measure, prepared to hear the next case, ready to serve once again as the instrument through which justice would flow to his people. The widow stepped forward, with the measured grace of one who had learned to carry sorrow with dignity. Her name was Naomi, and the lines around her eyes spoke of tears shed in private, away from the curious gaze of neighbours who might mistake grief for weakness. She clutched a small leather pouch in her weathered hands, the kind used to hold precious things, though what it contained was precious only to her. "My Lord King," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I am Naomi, daughter of Seth, widow of Boaz the stonecutter. My husband has been dead these 6 months, and I have come to you because there is nowhere else to turn." Solomon leaned forward slightly on his throne, his attention focused entirely on the woman before him. In the biblical world, widows occupied a sacred place in the heart of divine law. The scriptures were filled with commands to protect them, to ensure their rights, to remember that God himself was the defender of those who had no earthly protector. To judge a widow's case fairly was not merely a matter of legal procedure, it was a reflection of one's reverence for the Almighty. "Speak freely," the king said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that marked all his dealings with the vulnerable. "Tell me what troubles you, and know that your words will be heard with the same care, whether you come with gold or with empty hands." Naomi bowed her head gratefully. "My lord, when my husband died, I was left with little. Our house, some tools of his trade, and a small store of grain that was meant to see us through the winter. But grain spoils if not properly stored, and I knew nothing of such matters. My husband had always handled the business of buying and selling." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and Solomon waited patiently. Time in the biblical world was not measured by the urgency of efficiency, but by the rhythm of understanding. A wise king learned to listen not just to words, but to the silences between them, to the fears that hesitated on the tongue before finding courage to speak. "I took my grain to the market," Naomi continued, "seeking someone who might store it properly and give me a fair price when it was sold. This merchant," she gestured toward the man beside her, "offered to help. He seemed kind, and he spoke of knowing my husband in better days." The merchant, whose name was Zimri, shifted uncomfortably under the king's gaze. He was a man of middle years, his prosperity evident in the fine weave of his robes and the golden ornaments that decorated his belt. His beard was carefully trimmed, his hands soft from a life spent counting coins rather than working soil. When he spoke, his voice carried the smooth confidence of one accustomed to persuading others to see things his way. "My Lord King," Zimri said, bowing with practiced deference, "I have served the merchants of Jerusalem for 20 years, and my reputation for honesty is known throughout the city. This woman speaks of matters she does not understand. The storage of grain is a complex business, and the prices in the market change like the wind." Solomon's eyes remained fixed on the merchant, noting the careful way he spoke, the subtle implications in his words. Tell me of your arrangement with this woman. What agreement was made, and how was it sealed? Zimri spread his hands in a gesture that seemed open but revealed nothing. My lord, the woman brought me grain that was already showing signs of spoilage. Weevils had begun their work, and much of it was fit only for animal feed. I agreed to store what could be saved and to sell it when the market was favorable. I told her honestly that the grain was not of the highest quality. That is not true. Naomi's voice rose slightly, then caught herself, remembering where she stood. My lord, forgive me, but I must speak the truth. The grain was good grain, stored as my husband taught me. I checked it carefully before taking it to market, and there were no weevils, no spoilage. Solomon raised his hand gently, and both petitioners fell silent. The king studied them both for a long moment, his mind sifting through the possibilities. In his years on the throne, he had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed truth from falsehood. The way eyes moved when lies were spoken, the tension in shoulders that carried the weight of deception, the small inconsistencies that emerged when stories were built on shifting sand rather than solid ground. Tell me, Zimri, Solomon said at last, what price did you receive when the grain was sold? The merchant's confident expression flickered slightly. My lord, as I explained, the grain was of poor quality. It sold for the price such grain commands, perhaps 2 shekels of silver for the entire lot. 2 shekels? Naomi gasped. But my lord, that grain was worth at least 10 shekels, perhaps more. I know because my husband taught me to judge the quality of grain as carefully as he judged the quality of stone. Solomon nodded slowly. And what portion of those 2 shekels did you give to Naomi? My lord, after the costs of storage, the fees for handling, the risk I took in accepting grain of questionable quality, Zimri's words came more slowly now. I was able to give her half a shekel. The king's expression did not change, but something in the atmosphere of the throne room shifted. The scribes looked up from their parchments. The guards stood a little straighter, and even the morning light streaming through the high windows seemed to focus more intently on the scene unfolding before the throne. Bring me samples of grain from the royal storehouse, Solomon commanded. Bring grain of the finest quality, grain of medium quality, and grain that is truly spoiled. Let us see how well our merchant here can judge the difference. Within moments, servants appeared carrying small bowls of grain. The finest was golden and plump, each kernel perfect and whole. The medium quality was still good, but showed slight variations in color and size. The spoiled grain was clearly damaged, with holes from insects and a musty smell that carried even across the vast throne room. Zimri, the king said, you claim expertise in judging grain. Tell me, which of these samples most closely resembles what Naomi brought to you? The merchant approached the bowls nervously, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. He examined each sample, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the grains to the light. The assembly watched in silence as he struggled with a choice that should have been simple for one who claimed such expertise. The middle grade, my lord, he finally said, pointing to the medium quality grain. Yes, it was much like this. Solomon smiled, and there was something both gentle and terrible in that expression. Then you admit that the grain was not the spoiled, weevil-infested stock you first described. That it was, in fact, of merchantable quality. Zimri's face had grown pale. My lord, the storage costs were still significant, and the market price for grain of this quality, Solomon interrupted, his voice still gentle but carrying an edge of divine authority, is currently 8 shekels per measure in Jerusalem. I know this because the royal household purchases grain daily, and my stewards report to me each evening on the prices they have paid. The king rose from his throne, and the entire assembly held its breath. When Solomon stood to deliver judgment, it was a sign that the matter had moved beyond simple dispute into the realm of moral instruction, where earthly justice reflected heavenly principle. Zimri, son of Haggith, the king's voice carried clearly through the chamber, you have dealt falsely with a widow, seeking to profit from her grief and inexperience. The law commands us to deal honestly in all our measures and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You have violated both these commands. The merchant fell to his knees, his pretense finally crumbling. My lord, have mercy. I have a family, a business. I meant no harm. The harm was done, Solomon replied, not merely to this woman, but to the fabric of justice that holds our kingdom together. When the strong prey upon the weak, when merchants cheat widows, when those who should protect instead exploit, the very foundations of society begin to crumble. The king paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembly like stones dropped into still water. Around the throne room, nobles and officials shifted uncomfortably, each perhaps examining their own consciences, wondering if their own dealings would bear such scrutiny. Here then is my judgment, Solomon continued. You will return to Naomi, not the half shekel you gave her, but the full value of her grain, 8 shekels of silver. Additionally, you will pay her 2 shekels more as compensation for the hardship your deception has caused. And to ensure that you remember this lesson, you will contribute 10 shekels to the temple treasury as an offering for the sin of cheating a widow. Zimri's shoulders shook, whether from relief at avoiding harsher punishment or from the weight of his exposed shame, none could say. Yes, my lord, it will be done immediately. But Solomon was not finished. He descended the steps of his throne and approached Naomi, his royal robes rustling softly in the hushed chamber. When he stood before her, he spoke not with the voice of a king pronouncing judgment, but with the gentleness of a son speaking to his mother. Naomi, daughter of Seth, he said softly, your husband was known to me as an honest man whose stonework helped build the walls that protect our city. In his memory and in recognition of your faithfulness, I offer you a place in the royal household. My mother, the Queen Mother Bathsheba, has need of skilled women to help manage the palace stores. If you will accept, you will have not just work, but protection and honor. Tears flowed freely down Naomi's cheeks as she fell to her knees before the king. My lord, you are too gracious. I am not worthy of such kindness. It is not kindness, Solomon replied, helping her to her feet with his own hands, but justice. The God of Israel commands us to care for widows and orphans, and a king who ignores such commands is no king at all, but merely a man wearing a crown. As Naomi was led away by palace servants who would help her settle into her new position, and as Zimri departed to gather the silver he owed, Solomon returned to his throne. The second case of the morning was concluded, but its lessons would ripple outward through the kingdom. Word would spread that the king's justice protected the vulnerable, that dishonest dealing would be exposed and punished, that mercy and justice flowed together like twin streams from the throne of Israel. The herald stepped forward to announce the third case, and Solomon felt his heart grow heavy. 2 women approached the throne, and between them walked a temple servant carrying a small bundle, the case of the disputed child, the one that would require not just legal knowledge, but the deepest wells of wisdom and understanding. As the women took their places before the throne, Solomon offered a silent prayer, seeking once again the divine guidance that had never failed him. Some decisions could be made through careful reasoning and the application of law, but others required the kind of insight that came only from above, the ability to see into human hearts and understand the depths of love and deception that drove human action. The morning sun had climbed higher, painting new patterns of light and shadow across the throne room floor. Outside, the life of Jerusalem continued its ancient rhythm, but here in this sacred space, another moment of truth was about to unfold, another opportunity for heavenly wisdom to touch earthly need. And Solomon, feeling the weight of the crown and the lightness of divine grace in equal measure, prepared to render a judgment that would echo through the ages, a decision that would demonstrate once again that the throne of Israel served not human wisdom, but divine truth, not earthly power, but heavenly justice. The two women could not have been more different in appearance, yet both carried the unmistakable mark of recent motherhood, the soft fullness that spoke of nursing, the careful way they moved, the fierce protectiveness that radiated from them, like heat from glowing coals. The first woman, whose name was Tamar, was young and well-dressed, her robes of fine linen suggesting a household of some prosperity. The second, called Rahab, was older and careworn, her simple garments marking her as one who worked with her hands for daily bread. But it was the bundle carried by the temple servant that drew every eye in the throne room. Wrapped in soft wool dyed the colour of morning sky, a baby slept peacefully, unaware that his very existence had become the centre of a dispute that would test the wisdom of kings. Solomon studied the two women carefully, his eyes moving from face to face as he sought to read the stories written in their expressions. In the biblical world, motherhood was both blessing and burden, bringing with it not just joy, but also the constant spectre of loss. Infant mortality was high, and every mother lived with the knowledge that the child she nursed today might be taken by fever or accident tomorrow. "Speak," the king said gently, his voice carrying across the hushed throne room. "Tell me of this matter that brings you both before the throne of Israel." Tamar stepped forward first, her youth evident in the way she clutched her hands together, seeking courage. "My lord king, this woman and I live in the same house, in rooms that share a common wall. 3 days ago, in the darkest hour before dawn, I gave birth to this son. The labour was difficult, but by God's grace, both the child and I survived." She paused, glancing at Rahab with an expression that mixed grief with accusation. 2 days later, this woman also gave birth, but her child was born sleeping, never to draw breath in this world, and in her grief, she has done a terrible thing. Rahab's face flushed with emotion, but whether from anger or sorrow, none could tell. "My lord, do not listen to her lies. The child is mine, born of my body, nursed at my breast. She seeks to steal from me the only joy I have left in this world." Solomon raised his hand for silence, then looked at Tamar. "Continue with your account. Tell me what you claim this woman has done." "In the night, my lord, while I slept the deep sleep that comes after childbirth, she crept into my chamber. She took my living son from beside me and left her dead child in his place. When I woke to nurse my baby in the morning light, I found—" Tamar's voice broke, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. "I found the cold body of a child that was not mine. But when I looked more closely, I knew it was not my son. A mother knows her own child, my lord, as surely as she knows her own heartbeat." The throne room remained absolutely still as the weight of the accusation settled over the assembly. Child stealing was among the most heinous of crimes, a violation not just of law, but of the sacred bonds that held society together. If proven, it would demand the severest punishment. Rahab shook her head vigorously, her voice rising with indignation. "She lies, my lord. The child is mine. Look at him. See how he turns toward my voice, how he settles when I speak. Would a babe react so to a stranger? This woman's child died, and in her madness of grief, she has convinced herself that mine lives. But I am his mother, and I would know my own flesh." Solomon listened to both accounts with the patience that had become legendary throughout his kingdom. But as the women spoke, he was not merely hearing their words. He was watching their faces, observing the subtle signs that revealed truth from falsehood. The way Tamar's eyes never left the sleeping child, the protective stance she unconsciously adopted, the tremor in her voice that spoke of genuine anguish. And Rahab, the slight hesitation before she spoke, the way her gaze flickered away, when she mentioned her own supposed child. The defensive edge to her words that suggested a story built on shifting ground. Yet Solomon knew that observation alone, however keen, would not suffice for such a judgment. The women's testimonies directly contradicted each other, and there were no witnesses to support either claim. In such cases, the law provided certain procedures: oaths sworn before God, trials by ordeal. But these seemed inadequate for determining the truth about an infant who could not speak for himself. The king rose from his throne and descended the 6 golden steps, his movement causing a rustle of anticipation throughout the chamber. When he reached the bottom, he gestured to the temple servant who held the child. "Bring the baby to me," Solomon commanded softly. The servant approached with reverent care, placing the sleeping infant in the king's arms. Solomon had held many children during his reign, the sons and daughters of nobles brought for blessing, the babies of common folk who sought royal favor for their offspring. But each time he was struck anew by the miracle of new life, the perfect vulnerability of a soul fresh from the hand of God. The baby stirred slightly at the transfer, his tiny fist escaping the wool wrapping to wave gently in the air. His face was peaceful in sleep, unmarked by the conflict raging around him. Here was innocence itself, pure and untouched by the deceptions and desperate needs of the adult world. Solomon cradled the child for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Then, with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts, he handed the baby back to the servant and returned to his throne. "This is indeed a difficult matter," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. 2 women, both claiming the same child, both presenting themselves as the grieving mother, both demanding justice. He paused, allowing the tension to build. But justice requires truth, and truth in this case seems beyond the reach of human testimony. The scribes leaned forward, their pens poised to record whatever judgment the king might render. The nobles and officials watched with the fascination of those witnessing a master craftsman at work, knowing that whatever emerged from this moment would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Since both women claimed to be the mother, Solomon continued, his voice taking on a tone of grim resolution, and since we cannot determine by words alone which speaks the truth, we must turn to action. Guard! A soldier stepped forward immediately, his bronze sword gleaming in the morning light. The weapon was sharp and well maintained, its edge honed to deadly perfection. As he drew it from its sheath, the metallic ring echoed through the chamber like a bell tolling. "Take your sword," Solomon commanded, his voice steady and terrible, "and divide the living child in 2. Give half to one woman and half to the other. Thus both shall have an equal share, and justice will be served." The words fell like stones into still water, sending shockwaves of horror through the assembly. Several of the court ladies gasped audibly, and even the hardened guards shifted uncomfortably. The temple servant holding the baby took an involuntary step backward, his face pale with shock. But it was the reaction of the 2 women that Solomon watched with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. Rahab nodded grimly, as if accepting an unpleasant but necessary solution. "Yes, my lord," she said, her voice tight with what might have been suppressed emotion. "If I cannot have my child, then neither shall she. Let the sword divide him fairly." Tamar's response was immediate and visceral. She threw herself forward, falling to her knees before the throne with such force that the sound echoed through the chamber. "No!" she cried, her voice breaking with anguish. "My lord, please, give her the child. Give him to her alive. Do not harm him, I beg you. Better that he should live with another than die by the sword." The contrast could not have been more stark. One woman, willing to see the child destroyed rather than given to her rival. Another, willing to sacrifice her own claim rather than see harm come to the infant. The truth blazed forth like sunrise, illuminating not just the facts of the case, but the very nature of love itself. Solomon smiled, and it was like watching winter give way to spring. "Stop," he commanded the guard, who had not moved toward the child but had stood ready to obey whatever order came. "Sheath your sword. There will be no division here. No harm to this innocent one." The king stood once more, his voice ringing with authority and joy. "Give the living child to Tamar, for she is his mother. A true mother would rather lose her child than see him harmed. Love reveals itself not in claiming but in protecting, not in demanding but in sacrificing." Tamar collapsed in relief, her body shaking with sobs of gratitude as the temple servant placed her son in her arms. The baby, disturbed by the commotion, opened his eyes and looked up at her face, and something in that gaze seemed to confirm the wisdom of the judgment. Mother and child recognized each other with a bond that transcended words or legal arguments. Rahab stood silent, her deception exposed, her desperate gamble failed. But Solomon's gaze as it fell upon her was not filled with condemnation but with compassion. He understood the grief that had driven her to such desperate measures, the hollow ache of empty arms that had made another woman's child seem like salvation. "Rahab," the king said gently, "your grief is real, and your loss deserves acknowledgement. But taking another's child cannot fill the emptiness left by your own. Guards, escort her from the palace, but treat her with kindness. Grief makes people do things their hearts would normally reject." As Rahab was led away, her shoulders bowed with shame and sorrow, a murmur of amazement swept through the throne room. The assembled nobles and officials looked at each other with expressions of awe, recognizing that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The king's wisdom had not merely solved a legal dispute, it had revealed the very essence of human nature, the difference between possessive desire and sacrificial love. "Let this judgment be recorded," Solomon commanded the scribes, "not merely as a resolution of dispute, but as a teaching for all who would understand the nature of true affection. Love is known not by what it claims, but by what it protects, not by what it demands, but by what it surrenders for the good of the beloved." The morning was advancing, and the sounds from beyond the palace walls spoke of a city fully awakened to the business of the day. Merchants were calling their wares in the marketplace, children were playing in the streets, and the normal rhythm of life continued its ancient pattern. But within the throne room, those who had witnessed the judgment of the two mothers knew they had seen something that transcended the ordinary, a moment when divine wisdom had touched earthly need with perfect precision. As Tamar was escorted from the chamber, her son sleeping peacefully in her arms, Solomon felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and humility that followed such moments. The wisdom had not come from his own understanding, but from above, a gift granted to one who sought divine guidance with a sincere heart. Each successful judgment was both a vindication of his reign and a reminder of his complete dependence on the God who had appointed him to rule. The herald stepped forward to announce that the morning's petitions were concluded, but Solomon knew the day was far from over. The Egyptian ambassador still waited for his audience. The master builder needed approval for the temple plans, and the Queen Mother expected her consultation about the feast of the new moon. Each responsibility would require its own measure of wisdom, its own careful balance of competing interests and divine principles. But first, there would be a brief respite, a moment to step away from the throne and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. The king's private chamber adjoined the throne room, a smaller space where he could collect his thoughts and seek guidance for the decisions yet to come. It was furnished simply but elegantly, with a desk of cedar wood, shelves lined with scrolls of law and wisdom literature, and a window that looked out over the Temple Mount where God's house would soon rise. As Solomon moved toward this sanctuary, his mind was already turning to the afternoon's challenges. The temple was never far from his thoughts, the great project that would define his reign and serve as a dwelling place for the divine presence on earth. Every detail required his attention, from the massive foundation stones to the intricate carvings that would adorn the inner sanctuary. It was work that demanded not just administrative skill, but spiritual sensitivity. For this was no ordinary building, but the house of the Most High. The sounds of the palace continued around him as he walked. Servants preparing the midday meal, guards changing shifts, scribes copying documents in the administrative chambers. The machinery of government never stopped, but it all revolved around this central axis of wisdom and judgment that flowed from the throne. A kingdom was more than armies and treasures. It was a living organism sustained by justice and nurtured by the fear of the Lord. Soon, the afternoon sessions would begin, bringing new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that the throne of Israel served not human ambition, but divine purpose. The Egyptian ambassador would speak of trade agreements and political alliances, matters that touched on the complex relationships between nations in the ancient world. The master builder would present plans that needed to balance practical construction requirements with the sacred symbolism appropriate to God's house. But for now, for just a few precious moments, Solomon could step away from the public demands of kingship and return to the private communion with God that was the wellspring of all his wisdom. The morning had shown once again that when human understanding reached its limits, divine insight could pierce through to truth. The judgment of the two mothers would be remembered and retold, becoming part of the growing legend of Solomon's wisdom that was spreading throughout the known world. As the king reached the door of his private chamber, he paused to look back at the throne room one more time. The golden throne stood empty now, waiting for his return, its lion guardians keeping their eternal watch. The morning light streaming through the high windows painted everything in warm gold, creating an atmosphere of peace and majesty that spoke of divine favor resting upon the kingdom. The day was far from over, but already it had been marked by moments of grace, instances where heavenly wisdom had touched earthly need with transforming power. And Solomon, feeling once again the weight of responsibility and the lightness of divine guidance, prepared to continue the sacred work of ruling God's people with justice, mercy, and the fear of the Lord that was the beginning of all true wisdom. The afternoon sun cast longer shadows through the palace corridors as Solomon made his way toward the chamber where the master builder waited. The morning's judgments had concluded, but the king's day was far from finished. In biblical times, the work of a righteous ruler flowed like a river, continuous and life-giving, shaped by the banks of divine law but never truly at rest. Hiram of Tyre stood as the king entered, his weathered hands still bearing the calluses of a craftsman despite his elevated position as chief architect of the temple project. He was a man who understood both the practical demands of construction and the sacred requirements of building a house for the Almighty. Behind him, spread across a table of polished olive wood, lay the plans that would transform Solomon's vision into reality. "My Lord King," Hiram bowed deeply, his voice carrying the accent of his Phoenician homeland. "The drawings for the inner sanctuary are complete. Every measurement has been checked against the instructions given to Moses, every detail considered in light of the sacred purposes this chamber will serve." Solomon approached the table with the reverence due to something that would house the very presence of God. The parchments before him showed not merely architectural plans, but a map of the sacred, a blueprint for bringing heaven down to earth. The Holy of Holies, as it would be called, was to be a perfect cube, 20 cubits in length, width, and height, overlaid entirely with pure gold. "Show me the cherubim," Solomon said softly, his fingers tracing the delicate lines that represented the golden guardians who would spread their wings over the Ark of the Covenant. Hiram unrolled another scroll, revealing drawings of magnificent winged beings, each 10 cubits high, their faces turned toward each other in eternal contemplation of the mercy seat. "They will be carved from olive wood, my lord, then covered with gold leaf so pure it will seem to glow with inner light. Their wings will span the entire width of the sanctuary, creating a canopy of protection over the sacred ark." The king studied the drawings with the intensity of a scribe reading ancient prophecy. Every detail mattered, for this was not merely a building, but a dwelling place for the divine presence. The measurements were not arbitrary, but symbolic, reflecting the perfect order of creation itself. The golden walls would catch and reflect the light of the sacred lamps, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly beauty that would remind all who entered that they stood on holy ground. "And the doors?" Solomon inquired, remembering that even the entrances to sacred space required careful attention to both beauty and meaning. "Carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold, my lord. Each door will bear the image of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, representing the Garden of Eden, from which mankind was expelled, but to which the faithful may return through proper worship." Hiram's voice carried the satisfaction of a craftsman who had found the perfect marriage between artistry and significance. Solomon nodded slowly, his mind envisioning the completed sanctuary. When the high priest entered this space once each year on the Day of Atonement, he would walk through doors that spoke of paradise, beneath wings that sheltered the covenant, into a chamber that reflected the very throne room of heaven. It was work that demanded not just skill but sanctification, not just craftsmanship but consecration. "The craftsmen you have chosen," the king said, turning from the plans to study the master builder's face. "They understand the sacred nature of their work. They know they are not merely building walls, but creating a dwelling place for the Most High." Hiram smiled, his expression reflecting years of working with artisans who took their craft as seriously as priests took their prayers. "My lord, I have selected only those whose hearts are as skilled as their hands. They fast before beginning each day's work. They pray before touching hammer to chisel, and they speak in whispers while laboring, knowing that they build in the shadow of the Almighty." The afternoon light streaming through the chamber window caught the golden threads in Solomon's robe, creating patterns that danced across the architectural drawings. Outside, the sounds of construction could be heard from the Temple Mount itself, where thousands of workers were preparing the massive foundation stones that would anchor God's house to the earth. The rhythm of their work created a kind of music, a symphony of devotion played out in stone and cedar, bronze and gold. "Tell me of the pillars," Solomon said, moving to another set of drawings that showed the two great bronze columns that would stand at the temple's entrance. "Jachin and Boaz they shall be called, my lord, as you have instructed. He will establish, and in him is strength. Each will be 18 cubits high, crowned with capitals of bronze lilies and pomegranates. They will stand as witnesses to all who enter that this house belongs to the God who establishes kingdoms and in whose strength all earthly power finds its source." The symbolism was profound, reaching back through generations of Hebrew understanding to the very foundations of faith itself. Pilgrims approaching the temple would pass between these columns, their names serving as a declaration and a reminder. The God who had established his covenant with Abraham, who had given strength to Moses in the wilderness, who had raised David to the throne, was the same God who now dwelt among his people in this house of cedar and gold. Solomon spent the next hour examining every detail of the plans, asking questions that revealed not just administrative concern, but deep spiritual understanding. The temple was to be more than a building. It was to be a teaching tool, its every element designed to instruct the faithful about the nature of God and their relationship to Him. The golden lampstands would remind them that God was light, the table of showbread that He was their sustainer, the altar of incense that their prayers rose before Him like sweet fragrance. As the consultation drew to a close, Hiram rolled up the precious drawings with the care due to sacred documents. "My lord, if you approve these plans, we can begin the detailed work within the month. The bronze foundries are ready, the carvers have prepared their tools, and the gold has been refined to perfect purity. You have my approval," Solomon said, his voice carrying the weight of decision that would shape not just his own reign, but generations to come. Begin the work, but remember always that we build not for ourselves, but for the one who chose to dwell among his people. Let every nail be driven with reverence, every board fitted with prayer. As Hiram departed, his arms full of approved plans and his heart full of purpose, Solomon remained in the chamber, his thoughts turning to the magnitude of what lay ahead. The temple would take years to complete, requiring resources from across the known world and skills that pushed the boundaries of human craftsmanship. But more than that, it would require the continued blessing of the God for whom it was being built. The king moved to the window, looking out over the city, where the sounds of the normal life continued their ancient rhythm. Merchants closing their stalls as the day grew late, children being called home for the evening meal, the first cooking fires beginning to send their smoke into the gathering dusk. These were his people, the ones for whom the temple was being built, the ones whose worship would fill its courts and whose prayers would rise from its altars. Soon it would be time for the evening audience with the Queen Mother. But first, Solomon wanted to visit the temple site itself, to walk among the workers and see with his own eyes the progress of the great work. A king's presence among his people served not just to encourage their efforts, but to remind both ruler and ruled that they were partners in something greater than themselves. The royal guards formed their customary escort as Solomon left the palace, their bronze armor gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The streets of Jerusalem parted respectfully before the royal procession, citizens bowing as their king passed, but also calling out greetings and blessings. This was not the distant monarchy of other nations, but the intimate kingship that characterized Israel, where the ruler was seen as shepherd rather than overlord, servant rather than master. The Temple Mount rose before them like a promise carved in stone, its summit bustling with activity despite the advancing hour. Massive blocks of limestone, each one carefully cut and fitted, were being maneuvered into place by teams of workers whose coordination spoke of months of practice. The sound of their efforts created a rhythm that seemed almost musical, a percussion of hammers and chisels that sang of devotion made manifest in stone and cedar. Solomon walked among the workers, stopping to examine their craftsmanship, offering words of encouragement, asking about their families and their welfare. In biblical times, a king's concern for his people extended beyond mere administration to genuine care for their daily lives. These men were not just laborers but fellow servants of the Most High, their work as sacred as any priestly duty. "How goes the work?" the king asked one of the foremen, a grizzled veteran whose hands bore the scars of decades working with stone. "Well, my lord," the man replied, wiping sweat from his brow with obvious satisfaction. "The foundation is nearly complete, and we have begun raising the walls. Each stone fits as if it were made for its place, and the work moves forward with a smoothness that speaks of divine blessing." Solomon nodded, remembering the prophecy that the temple would be built in silence, without the sound of hammer or chisel during the final assembly. Every stone was being prepared with perfect precision at the quarries, ready to slide into place as smoothly as pieces of a divine puzzle. It was work that required not just skill, but faith, trusting that measurements taken at distant sites would prove perfect when brought together in this sacred place. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the limestone walls in shades of gold and amber, Solomon climbed to the highest point of the construction, where he could see not just the work being done, but the vision it would become. From here, the completed temple rose in his mind's eye, walls of dressed stone, beams of cedar, courts filled with worshippers, smoke rising from altars where prayers ascended to heaven like incense. The evening call to prayer drifted across the city, voices joining in the ancient words that had bound the people of Israel together since the days of Abraham. Below, work was beginning to slow as the day's labor drew to a close, but the rhythm of construction would resume with tomorrow's dawn, each day bringing the great project closer to completion. Solomon stood in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of human devotion and divine blessing, feeling once again the weight of responsibility and the lightness of grace that marked every aspect of his reign. The temple rising around him was more than stone and wood. It was faith made visible, devotion carved in cedar and gold, a dwelling place for the God who had chosen to make his home among his people. Soon he would need to return to the palace, to the consultation with his mother about the feast of the new moon, to the evening rituals that would close another day in the life of a biblical king. But for now, for just a few more precious moments, he stood surrounded by the work of holy hands, watching the sun set over Jerusalem and feeling the peace that came from knowing that every decision, every effort, every prayer was part of a larger purpose that stretched from the foundations of the earth to the throne of heaven itself. The day was not yet finished, but already it had been marked by the steady progress of sacred work, the careful application of divine wisdom to human need, and the quiet satisfaction that came from serving the God who had established his throne, not for personal glory, but for the blessing of all who would seek refuge in the shadow of his wings. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Jerusalem, Solomon prepared to descend from the Temple Mount, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that the throne of Israel served not earthly ambition, but heavenly purpose. The rhythm of royal life would continue, measured not by the urgency of human desire, but by the patient cadence of divine will, unfolding day by day like a scroll written by the finger of God himself. The palace had grown quieter as evening approached, the bustle of daytime administration giving way to the gentler rhythms of dusk. Oil lamps flickered to life in corridors and chambers, their warm glow replacing the fading daylight that had illuminated the king's morning judgments and afternoon consultations. But Solomon's day was far from complete. For in biblical times, the work of a righteous ruler extended from the first prayer before dawn to the final blessings spoken over his household as night settled over the kingdom. The Queen Mother's chambers occupied a place of honor within the palace complex, their windows facing east toward the Mount of Olives, where the morning light would first touch the royal residence each day. These rooms spoke of dignity rather than ostentation, furnished with pieces that reflected both comfort and the reverence due to one who had been beloved of King David and now served as counselor to his son. Tapestries woven in deep blues and purples adorned the walls, their patterns depicting pomegranates and olive branches, symbols of abundance and peace. Bathsheba rose as Solomon entered, her movement graceful despite the years that had silvered her hair and lined her face with the marks of wisdom earned through both joy and sorrow. She had been beautiful once, beautiful enough to catch the eye of a king, but now her beauty was of a different kind, the radiance that comes from a life lived in service to purposes greater than oneself. "My son," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had comforted him through childhood and continued to provide guidance in the complexities of kingship. "Come, sit with me, while there is still light enough to speak of the feast preparations." Solomon settled into the chair across from her, feeling some of the weight of the crown lift from his shoulders in this sanctuary of maternal wisdom. Here, he was not just the king of Israel, but also a son seeking counsel from one who had navigated the treacherous waters of palace politics with grace and survived the storms that could destroy lesser souls. "Tell me of your concerns about the new moon celebration," he said, noting the slight furrow in her brow that spoke of matters requiring careful consideration. Bathsheba lifted a scroll from the cedar table beside her chair, its parchment covered with lists written in the precise hand of palace scribes. "The tribal leaders have confirmed their attendance, but there are delicate matters of precedence to consider. Judah expects the place of honor, being your own tribe, but Benjamin grows restless at always being seated after the royal house, and the northern tribes watch carefully to ensure they are not slighted in favor of those from the south." The Feast of the New Moon was more than a religious observance. It was a carefully orchestrated display of unity, an opportunity for the king to demonstrate that his reign served all 12 tribes equally, while maintaining the divine order that had established David's house upon the throne. Each seating arrangement, each ceremonial role, each public recognition carried weight that could strengthen or strain the bonds, holding the kingdom together. "What of the Levites?" Solomon asked, knowing that the priestly tribe held a unique position that transcended the usual tribal rivalries. They request permission to present the new temple vessels that have been completed since the last gathering. The golden lampstands are finished, and the craftsmen wish to display their work before the assembled leaders. Bathsheba's eyes brightened slightly as she spoke of the temple, for she understood better than most what the great project meant to her son's reign and to the spiritual life of the nation. Solomon nodded thoughtfully. The temple construction provided a unifying focus for the kingdom, a project that drew resources and energy from all tribes toward a common sacred purpose. Displaying the completed vessels would remind the gathered leaders that their individual concerns were part of a larger tapestry being woven by divine hands. "And the entertainment for the evening?" he inquired, knowing that such gatherings required not just formal ceremony, but moments of joy that would send the tribal representatives home with warm memories of royal hospitality. "The court musicians have prepared new songs celebrating the peace of your reign and the prosperity that flows from wisdom guided by the fear of the Lord. The dancers from the house of Asaph will perform the sacred dances that tell the story of our people's journey from Egypt to the Promised Land." Bathsheba paused, consulting her scroll again. "There is also a request from the Merchants Guild to present a demonstration of the new trade goods arriving from distant lands. Spices from Arabia, ivory from Africa, silk from the Far Eastern kingdoms." The mention of trade brought to Solomon's mind the afternoon's audience with the Egyptian ambassador, a meeting that had gone well, but raised questions about the delicate balance between prosperity and dependence. The wealth flowing into Israel through expanded commerce was transforming the kingdom, bringing luxuries that previous generations could never have imagined, but also creating new challenges and temptations. "Mother," Solomon said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "you have lived through the reigns of both my father and myself. You have seen how prosperity can strengthen a kingdom, but also how it can lead hearts away from the source of all blessing. How do we celebrate God's goodness without forgetting that every gift comes from his hand?" Bathsheba set down the scroll and looked at her son with the expression she had worn when he was a child, asking questions that revealed wisdom beyond his years. "You asked the right question, which is itself a sign that your heart remains humble before the Lord. Your father David knew both the blessing of victory and the burden of abundance. He learned that the greatest danger to a king is not his enemies but his own success." She rose and moved to the window, where the last light of day was painting Jerusalem in soft gold. The feast should indeed celebrate the prosperity of the kingdom, but it must also remind all who attend that our wealth comes not from our own cleverness, but from covenant faithfulness. Let the display of treasures be accompanied by readings from the law. Let the songs of prosperity be balanced with hymns of dependence upon the Almighty. Solomon joined her at the window, looking out over the city where cooking fires were beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars. In the distance, the Temple Mount rose against the darkening sky, its construction's scaffolding outlined against the evening light, like the skeleton of a great promise yet to be fulfilled. "There is wisdom in your counsel," he said. "The feast will celebrate not just what we have gained, but what we have been given, not just our prosperity, but our responsibility to use that prosperity in service of divine purposes." As they spoke, a gentle knock at the chamber door announced the arrival of the evening meal. In the royal household, even the simple act of dining was touched with ceremony and significance. The food was blessed before being served, the conversation seasoned with gratitude for the abundance that graced the royal table. Tonight's meal was simple by palace standards: bread baked from the finest wheat, fish from the Sea of Galilee, fruits from the royal orchards, and wine from vines that had been tended with the same care given to sacred duties. As they ate, Bathsheba shared stories from the early days of David's reign, tales of how the kingdom had grown from a small collection of tribes into a nation respected throughout the known world. She spoke of the challenges her late husband had faced, the wisdom he had gained through both triumph and failure, and the lessons that could guide Solomon as he navigated the complexities of his own reign. "Your father used to say that a king's greatest asset was not his army or his treasury, but his memory," she said, breaking a piece of bread with hands that had once been as smooth as silk, but now bore the gentle marks of age and service. The memory of where his people had come from, what they had endured, what they had learned about the character of the God who had chosen them for his own. Solomon listened with the attention he had given to her stories since childhood, understanding that these were not just tales of the past, but lessons for the present. Each account of David's struggles and victories carried wisdom that could illuminate the challenges of his own reign, insights that could only come from one who had stood beside the throne through years of both glory and tribulation. As the meal concluded and the servants quietly cleared the table, mother and son continued their conversation, moving from the practical details of feast preparation to the deeper questions that occupied the heart of any ruler who sought to govern according to divine will. They spoke of justice and mercy, of the balance between strength and compassion, of the delicate art of leading a people who were chosen by God but remained stubbornly human in their needs and desires. The oil lamps burned lower as the evening progressed, their flames creating dancing shadows on the chamber walls. Outside, Jerusalem settled into the quiet rhythms of night, the sounds of day giving way to the gentle murmur of families gathering for evening prayers, children being tucked into their beds, and watchmen taking their posts on the city walls. "My son," Bathsheba said as the hour grew late, "you carry a burden that would crush a lesser man. But remember that you do not carry it alone. The God who placed you on this throne walks beside you in every decision, stands with you in every challenge, and will never leave you to face the darkness without his light." Solomon felt the truth of her words settle over him like a comfortable cloak. The day had been long and filled with decisions that would ripple through the kingdom for years to come. The morning's judgments, the afternoon's consultations, the evening's preparations, all had required wisdom that came not from his own understanding, but from the divine source that never failed those who sought it with sincere hearts. As he prepared to leave his mother's chambers and return to his own quarters for the night, Solomon paused to look once more out the window toward the Temple Mount. Even in the darkness, he could sense the presence of the great work rising there, stone by stone, beam by beam, a dwelling place for the God who had promised to make his home among his people. The feast of the new moon would come and go, bringing its own challenges and opportunities. The temple would continue its steady progress toward completion, each day bringing new marvels of craftsmanship and devotion. The business of the kingdom would flow on like a great river, carrying within its current the hopes and dreams of a people called to be different from all the nations around them. But for now, as night settled over Jerusalem and the first stars appeared in the clear sky above the palace, Solomon felt the deep satisfaction that came from another day spent in service to purposes greater than himself. The crown might be heavy, but it was a weight shared with the one who had established his throne, not for personal glory, but for the blessing of all who would seek refuge in the shadow of divine wings. The king's private chambers awaited, where the day would end as it had begun, in prayer, in gratitude, in quiet communion with the God who had called him to rule, and who provided the wisdom needed for each new dawn. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate that the throne of Israel served not human ambition, but heavenly justice. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, as Solomon made his way through corridors lit by flickering oil lamps, past guards who stood their silent watch, toward the chamber where rest waited like a blessing earned through faithful service, He carried with him the peace that came from knowing that every decision had been filtered through divine wisdom, every judgment rendered in the fear of the Lord, every moment of the day offered as an act of worship to the one who had made him king, not for his own sake, but for the sake of those he served. The rhythm of royal life would begin again with tomorrow's dawn. But for now, the day was complete, marked by wisdom given and received, by justice dispensed and mercy shown, by the steady progress of sacred work and the quiet satisfaction of duties faithfully performed. In the biblical world, there was no higher calling than to serve as God's appointed shepherd over his chosen people. And Solomon, feeling the weight of that calling and the joy of that privilege in equal measure, prepared to close another chapter in the long story of Israel's kings. The chamber door closed softly behind him, and King Solomon stood alone in the sanctuary of his private quarters. The oil lamps had been lit by faithful servants who had learned to anticipate his needs without intrusion, their warm light casting gentle shadows across walls lined with scrolls and sacred texts. Here, in this most intimate space of the palace, the transformation could begin once more, from public king back to private man seeking communion with his Creator. The weight of the crown had grown familiar over the years, but it never ceased to remind him of the sacred trust it represented. Solomon lifted it carefully from his brow, feeling his shoulders relax as the golden circlet settled onto its cedar stand. The royal robes followed, each garment removed with the reverence due to symbols of divine appointment. The purple sash, the embroidered tunic, the ceremonial sword, all were laid aside until only the simple linen shift remained, white as morning clouds and soft as whispered prayers. But even as the external trappings of kingship were set aside, the responsibilities they represented remained. A shepherd does not cease caring for his flock when he removes his cloak, and a king appointed by heaven does not abandon his people when he seeks solitude for prayer. The evening hours were not an escape from duty, but a return to its source, a drawing near to the wellspring from which all wisdom flowed. The ritual of evening ablution began with the same care that had marked the morning's preparations. Cool water from a silver basin, drawn from the palace's deepest well, washed away the dust and heat of the day's labors. But this cleansing was more than physical. It was symbolic, a casting off of the day's concerns and a preparation for the sacred communion that would close each day as it had begun. From a shelf carved into the stone wall, Solomon took his personal scroll of the Psalms, many of them written by his father David during his own years of kingship. The parchment was soft with handling, the ink faded but still clear, carrying across the years the heart cries of a man who had learned to find God in both triumph and trial. These were not just songs, but prayers made permanent, wisdom distilled into verse, the very breath of a soul that had walked closely with the Almighty through all the seasons of life. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," Solomon read softly, his voice barely disturbing the chamber's peace. The familiar words carried new meaning each time he spoke them, for each day brought fresh understanding of what it meant to be both shepherd and sheep, to lead others while following the divine guidance that alone could keep a kingdom on the path of righteousness. The Psalms spoke of struggles that transcended the centuries, the burden of leadership, the loneliness of decision, the constant need for wisdom beyond human understanding. David had faced enemies with swords. Solomon faced the more subtle challenges of prosperity and peace, but both had learned that the greatest battles were fought not on external battlefields, but in the quiet chambers of the heart, where pride wrestled with humility and human wisdom contended with divine truth. As the evening prayers deepened, the sounds of the palace grew fainter. Servants moved through distant corridors with the hushed steps of those who understood that their king's communion with God was the foundation upon which everything else rested. Guards took their posts with quiet efficiency, their vigilance allowing the ruler to lay aside his earthly concerns and focus on the eternal relationships that gave meaning to temporal power. The prayer moved from recitation to meditation, from speaking to listening. In the stillness that settled over the chamber like a gentle blanket, Solomon felt again the presence that had visited him in dreams and visions. The divine wisdom that had become his greatest treasure and most reliable counselor. The challenges of tomorrow began to clarify in his mind, not the overwhelming anxieties they might seem to human understanding, but opportunities for divine wisdom to demonstrate its perfect sufficiency. The feast of the new moon would indeed require careful orchestration, balancing the competing interests of tribal pride with the unity that must characterize God's chosen people. But the same wisdom that had revealed the true mother of the disputed child would guide the delicate negotiations of royal protocol. The temple construction would face new challenges as the work grew more complex, but the God for whom it was being built would provide solutions that human ingenuity alone could never devise. A soft knock at the chamber door announced the final ritual of the royal day. Benaiah entered with the reverent step of one approaching sacred space, carrying in his hands a small golden lamp and a bowl of oil pressed from the first olives of the season. This was the evening anointing, a private ceremony that bookended each day of Solomon's reign, a quiet renewal of the covenant between the earthly king and his heavenly sovereign. The oil was warm against Solomon's forehead, its fragrance rising like incense in the still air. This anointing was different from the great ceremony that had marked his coronation, witnessed by thousands and celebrated throughout the kingdom. This was intimate, personal, a daily reminder that kingship was not a position to be grasped, but a calling to be received fresh each morning and renewed each evening. "May the Lord bless you and keep you," Benaiah whispered, the ancient benediction that had been spoken over kings and commoners alike since the days of Moses. "May his face shine upon you and give you peace." As the young servant withdrew, Solomon felt the familiar sense of completion that marked the end of each day's service. The morning had begun with prayer and would end the same way, creating a circle of devotion that enclosed all the day's activities within the embrace of divine purpose. Every judgment rendered, every decision made, every word spoken had been offered as an act of worship to the God who had established his throne, not for personal glory, but for the blessing of his people. The oil lamp on the bedside table flickered gently, its flame steady and sure, a small sun that would keep watch through the hours of darkness. Outside the chamber windows, Jerusalem slept under the protection of walls built by faithful hands and guards who understood that their ultimate trust was not in bronze or stone, but in the God who neither slumbered nor slept. Solomon settled onto his bed, its frame carved from cedars of Lebanon and its coverings woven from the finest linen. But luxury was not the goal of royal rest. Rather, sleep was another form of surrender, a nightly acknowledgement that even kings must lay aside their efforts and trust in the one who worked while they rested, who watched over Israel's sleep and prepared tomorrow's grace during the quiet hours of night. The scroll of Psalms lay open beside him, and by the gentle light of the oil lamp, Solomon read once more the words that had comforted his father and would comfort generations of kings yet to come. "I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." The day had been full, morning prayers leading to afternoon judgments, royal consultations flowing into evening council, each moment connected to the next by the golden thread of divine purpose. The disputed child had been restored to his true mother. The widow had found justice and protection. The temple plans had been approved and blessed. Small victories, perhaps, in the grand sweep of history, but each one a demonstration that heaven's wisdom could touch earth's need with transforming power. Tomorrow would bring the Egyptian ambassador's final proposals, requiring careful consideration of how Israel's growing prosperity should be managed in relationship with neighboring powers. The temple construction would face new challenges as the work moved from foundation to walls, from massive stones to delicate carvings. The feast of the new moon would demand all the diplomatic skill that years of kingship had taught him, balancing tribal sensitivities with the unity that must mark God's chosen people. But those were tomorrow's concerns, to be met with tomorrow's grace and guided by the same divine wisdom that had proved sufficient for every challenge thus far. Tonight was for rest, for gratitude, for the quiet communion that prepared both heart and mind for whatever the new day might bring. As sleep began to claim him, Solomon's last conscious thought was a prayer of thanksgiving for the privilege of serving as shepherd to the people God had chosen for his own. The crown lay silent on its stand. The royal robes hung motionless in their place. But the calling they represented continued even in sleep. For a true king's heart never ceased to beat with concern for those entrusted to his care. The oil lamp flickered once and settled into steady burning, its light keeping gentle watch over the chamber, where Israel's wisest king found rest in the shadow of divine wings. Outside, Jerusalem slept in peace, protected by walls built with faithful hands, but ultimately kept safe by the one who had promised never to forsake his people. The rhythm of royal life would begin again with dawn's first light, but for now, all was quiet, all was well, and the kingdom rested secure in the knowledge that its shepherds slept under the watchful care of the great shepherd himself. And so, dear friend, our gentle journey through a day in the life of a biblical king draws to its close, like the evening shadows that stretched across Jerusalem's ancient stones. We've walked with Solomon from the first whispered prayers of dawn to the final anointing of dusk, witnessing how every moment of a godly ruler's life was woven together with threads of divine purpose. In those quiet pre-dawn hours, we saw how true authority begins not with commanding others, but with surrendering oneself to the Almighty. The king who would judge thousands first knelt as a servant, seeking wisdom that could only come from above. His morning prayers weren't mere ritual, but the foundation upon which every decision would rest, every judgment would stand. We witnessed the delicate art of biblical justice, where earthly wisdom met heavenly truth in cases that revealed the depths of human nature itself. The boundary stones moved by time and flood, the widow cheated by those who should have protected her, the desperate mothers whose love was tested by the edge of a sword. Each situation demanded not just legal knowledge, but the kind of insight that pierces through deception to find the heart of truth. And we saw how the business of kingship extended far beyond the throne room, reaching into every corner of the kingdom like morning light touching distant hills. The temple rising stone by stone, each measurement a prayer made manifest in cedar and gold. The careful diplomacy required to hold 12 tribes together as one people, united in purpose, yet diverse in heritage. The endless consultations and preparations that turned royal authority into genuine service. Perhaps most beautifully, we observed how the sacred and the everyday danced together in perfect harmony. A king's morning ablutions became an act of consecration, the reading of ancient laws transformed into fresh guidance for contemporary challenges. Even the simple act of sharing a meal with his mother became an opportunity for wisdom to pass from one generation to the next, like precious oil poured from vessel to vessel. The day we've shared reveals something profound about leadership in biblical times. It wasn't about the accumulation of power, but about the faithful stewardship of divine trust. Every crown was temporary, every throne established by heaven's decree, every ruler ultimately accountable to the one who sees all hearts and judges all motives. As we watched Solomon's day unfold, we saw how the weight of responsibility was balanced by the lightness of divine grace, how the loneliness of command was eased by the comfort of constant communion with God, how the complexity of human problems yielded to the simplicity of heaven's wisdom when sought with a humble heart. The oil lamp that kept watch through the night reminds us that God's care never sleeps, never grows weary, never abandons those who seek to serve him faithfully. Just as that gentle flame provided light through the darkness, divine wisdom illuminated every decision, every judgment, every moment of uncertainty that marked the royal day. So as you settle into your own rest tonight, perhaps you can carry with you something of what we've witnessed, the peace that comes from beginning each day in prayer, the wisdom that emerges when we listen more than we speak, the strength that flows from understanding our place in purposes greater than ourselves. Let the rhythm of Solomon's day become a gentle lullaby, the ancient stones of Jerusalem, a soft pillow for weary thoughts. The morning prayers that began before dawn, the careful judgments rendered with divine wisdom, the evening anointing that renewed covenant promises. All of it speaks to the timeless truth that the best leaders are those who understand they are servants first, shepherds before they are kings. The temple that rose during Solomon's reign still echoes in our hearts tonight, not built of stone and cedar now, but of faith and hope, prayer and service. Each act of kindness becomes a golden ornament, every moment of justice a cornerstone laid in righteousness, every prayer a sweet incense rising toward heaven. Sleep now, friend, in the peace that comes from walking with ancient wisdom, from seeing how earthly authority, when properly exercised, becomes a reflection of heavenly love. Let the gentle sounds of a kingdom at rest lull you toward dreams. The soft footsteps of faithful servants, the distant murmur of evening prayers, the quiet confidence of walls built strong and guards who watch through the night. The day of the King is complete, marked by wisdom given and received, by justice tempered with mercy, by power exercised in service rather than self-interest. And somewhere in the gentle transition from consciousness to sleep, perhaps you'll hear the echo of that ancient benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of the ancient world, rest well, knowing that the same divine wisdom that guided Solomon's reign continues to watch over all who seek it with sincere hearts. The oil lamp burns low, the prayers are complete, and the gentle King of all ages keeps watch through the night. Sweet dreams, dear friend. The ancient stories sleep with you, and tomorrow's grace awaits with the dawn.